Something enormous just shifted in the global order, and most Americans are still looking the wrong way. Right now, as you are watching this, a war that began on February 28, 2026, is reshaping everything you thought you knew about how the world works, who holds the real power, and what happens when the old rules simply stop applying. On that day, the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes on Iran under Operation Epic Fury, targeting military facilities, nuclear sites, and leadership, resulting in the death of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. That single moment cracked open a fault line that has been building for decades, and what is pouring through that crack right now is not just fire and smoke. It is a fundamental reorganization of global power, global economics, and what the word peace even means in a world where the United States no longer holds all the cards. Brent crude oil prices surpassed $100 per barrel on 8 March 2026 for the first time in 4 years, rising to $126 per barrel at its peak, and the closure of that narrow strip of water called the Strait of Hormuz has been described as the world's largest supply disruption since the 1970s energy crisis. And now, right now, this week, China and Pakistan have walked onto the world stage and dropped a 5-point peace plan that has rattled every assumption inside the Washington foreign policy establishment. This is not just news. This is history being written in real time. Let us start from where we actually are, because context matters enormously here, and most of the coverage you have seen is leaving out the deeper architecture of what is happening. When the bombs started falling on Iran in late February, the immediate Western framing was simple and clean. America was finally doing what needed to be done, finishing the nuclear threat, neutralizing a rogue state. That was the surface story, but beneath that surface, something else was already in motion. Iran did not collapse. Iran did not surrender. Instead, Iran did something that exposed the single most dangerous vulnerability in the entire global economic system. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps issued warnings prohibiting vessel passage through the Strait of Hormuz, leading to an effective halt in shipping traffic. 20% of all the world's oil passes through that narrow waterway every single day, and when that passage stopped, the entire planet felt it simultaneously. Think about what that actually means for a moment. This is not an abstraction. The average price of gasoline in the United States passed $4 for the first time since 2022. Americans filling up their tanks, paying more for groceries, watching their household budgets get squeezed. That is the direct result of a military campaign sold as a clean, decisive operation. U.S. government officials and Wall Street analysts began considering the prospect that oil prices might surge to an unprecedented $200 a barrel, and fertilizers, which most people never think about, became a sudden crisis point. Up to 30% of internationally traded fertilizers normally transit the Strait of Hormuz, which means food prices are next, which means the pain hitting American families right now is not the end of the damage. It may be the beginning of it. Now here is where it gets truly interesting, and where the China-Pakistan peace initiative stops being just a diplomatic news story and becomes something much larger. China did not come to this moment as a neutral party. China came as a country with the most to lose from a prolonged war and the most to gain from ending it on its own terms. Data from tanker tracking firm Kepler shows China imported about 1.38 million barrels per day of crude from Iran in 2025, roughly 12% of its total imports. And beyond oil, according to the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, total China-Iran trade, including unreported oil imports, reached about $41.2 billion in 2025. In 2021, both countries signed a 25-year strategic cooperation agreement under which Beijing pledged major investment in exchange for discounted Iranian oil. So when China says it wants peace in the Gulf, what China really means is that it wants the arteries of its own economic bloodstream reopened. That is not cynicism, that is clarity. And understanding that motivation is how you begin to understand why this peace plan actually carries real weight. Pakistan's role in all of this is arguably even more fascinating, because Pakistan is doing something that very few countries in the world have the relationships and the positioning to do. Pakistan maintains close ties with both Washington and Tehran, and has in recent days positioned itself as an intermediary, saying it conveyed to Iran a US peace plan. Let that land for a second. Pakistan, not Qatar, not Oman, not Switzerland. Pakistan is the country carrying messages between the United States and Iran. Pakistan has reportedly taken on a leadership role in mediation, one typically reserved for countries such as Qatar and Oman that have now been caught under Iranian fire. The traditional neutral brokers are themselves in the conflict zone. Qatar's LNG infrastructure has been damaged. The Gulf states that normally play quiet diplomatic roles are now targets. And into that vacuum stepped Pakistan, a country with nuclear weapons of its own, deep historical ties to the Islamic world, a close military partnership with China, and a long-standing, if complicated, relationship with Washington. Pakistani Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar flew to Beijing on March 31st, and what came out of that meeting was the five-point plan that is now at the center of global diplomatic attention. The proposal calls for an immediate cessation of hostilities with humanitarian assistance allowed to all war-affected areas, the start of peace talks as soon as possible under the principle of safeguarding the independence and security of Iran and the Gulf states, a commitment from all parties to refrain from the use or threat of use of force during peace talks, an immediate stop to attacks on important infrastructure, including energy, desalination and power facilities, and peaceful nuclear infrastructure, and early and safe passage of civilian and commercial ships, and restoration of normal passage through the strait as soon as possible. That last point is everything. That is the lever that moves China, that is the lever that moves global markets, and that is the lever that gives this plan actual teeth rather than just diplomatic language. What makes this historically significant is something that the mainstream American conversation has almost entirely missed. The five-point proposal is the first time a key global power has stated a pathway to end the war that began on February 28th. China is the world's second-largest economy. It is the top buyer of oil from both Iran and Saudi Arabia, and it just put its name on a peace framework that the United States did not write, did not lead, and did not control. China stepping in as a mediator in a war launched by the US would be a remarkable geopolitical twist. That is how one report described it. Now, a remarkable geopolitical twist, and that careful language barely scratches the surface of what this actually represents in terms of the shifting architecture of global power. When you look at the reaction from Washington, that is where the real story lives. Trump said the negotiations with Iran are going well. Asked specifically about the Pakistani-Chinese initiative, Trump didn't criticize it but simply reiterated that the diplomacy was going well. Now that response is revealing in ways that deserve careful attention. The Trump administration did not dismiss the China-Pakistan plan. It did not condemn it. It did not issue a statement calling it interference. What it did was absorb it, acknowledge it obliquely, and move on, which tells you something important. There are conversations happening behind closed doors that the public posturing does not reflect. And it tells you something even more important. The United States, for all its military firepower, needs this war to end too. Oil executives and analysts warn that the Strait of Hormuz needs to be reopened by mid-April, or oil supply disruptions will get significantly worse. That deadline is now, and that pressure is very real. There is also something that the moral dimension of this war demands we look at honestly, because this is not just economics and strategy. Israel has attacked Iranian gas fields, energy facilities, and manufacturing centers. US President Donald Trump has threatened to obliterate Iran's energy grid in retaliation for it wresting control of the Strait of Hormuz. Wide-scale attacks on a foe's energy infrastructure are generally considered war crimes. And on the Iranian side, Iran has responded to Israeli strikes on its infrastructure by launching thousands of missiles and drones at both Israeli and Arab Gulf states' energy installations and civilian infrastructure. The destruction is running in both directions, and the people paying the price on every side are civilians. Iranian families, Gulf workers, South Asian migrant laborers, and ordinary Americans watching their cost of living climb without any real explanation from their government about why a war they were barely consulted on is now hitting them in the wallet every single day. Over 220,000 Indian nationals have been repatriated from the Gulf Cooperation Council region and Iran due to the escalating conflict and the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. That detail alone tells you how wide the human displacement from this conflict already is. The war that was supposed to be done in 5 weeks, according to Trump's own stated timeline, is now stretching past that marker with no ceasefire in sight, and a peace plan coming not from Washington's allies in Europe, but from Beijing and Islamabad. The head of the International Energy Agency described the situation caused by the war as the greatest global energy security challenge in history. That is not a think tank analyst hedging their language. That is the head of the IEA, greatest in history. And yet the coverage in America treats this as a background story, as a foreign policy footnote, rather than what it actually is. A civilizational inflection point that will shape the next 20 years of American life. Here is what you need to understand about the deeper architecture, and this is where the analysis really has to go beyond headlines. China has been building toward this moment for a long time. The Belt and Road Initiative, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, the 25-year deal with Iran, the quiet expansion of Chinese naval presence in the Indian Ocean. None of these are accidents, none of these are impulsive. They are parts of a long strategic vision. China's motivations are clear and self-interested: protecting energy security, safeguarding Belt and Road Initiative and CPEC investments across the region, and burnishing its image as a global peace broker. A prolonged war and high oil prices directly hurt China's economy. But here is the thing: a country acting in its self-interest to end a war is not necessarily a bad actor on the global stage. The United States itself built its entire post-war foreign policy on the logic that American interests and global stability aligned. China is now making the same argument on the same stage with a similar vocabulary. That is a moment worth sitting with, because it is not simple, and it is not something that resolves neatly into good guys and bad guys. Pakistan's diplomatic gambit deserves its own serious examination. The image of Pakistani Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar flying to Beijing despite a hairline shoulder fracture, sustained just the day before during a meeting with Egypt's Foreign Minister in Islamabad, that small human detail captures something essential about the urgency inside Pakistan's diplomatic drive right now. This is not routine diplomacy. This is a country that understands it sits at a crossroads of civilizations, that its relationships with China, the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Iran give it a unique leverage that no other nation currently possesses, and that this moment, this specific window, may not last. Islamabad has stepped up its diplomatic engagement in recent days, hosting regional powers including Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt, and supporting indirect communication channels between Washington and Tehran. Pakistan is not just carrying messages, it is actively constructing the architecture of a potential peace, and it is doing so at a moment when the traditional Western-led institutions have been largely paralyzed. The economic data coming out of this conflict is staggering in its scope and its implications for everyday Americans. Bloomberg Economics put the US CPI for March at 3.4% year-on-year, a marked increase from 2.4% in February, with rising fuel prices the main culprit. And analysts are warning this is just the beginning of the transmission. At $170 a barrel, the impact on inflation and growth roughly doubles, a stagflationary shock that could shift everything from the path ahead for central banks to the outcome of the US midterm elections. That is the word that should be ringing alarm bells in Washington right now: stagflation, inflation rising while growth slows, the economic nightmare scenario that America last lived through in the 1970s, which is the exact comparison analysts keep reaching for when describing what happens if the strait stays closed. The war has precipitated a second major energy crisis and subsequently economic crisis for Europe, primarily through the suspension of Qatari liquefied natural gas and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, with economists warning that energy-intensive economies face high risks of technical recession if the maritime blockade persists through the summer. And what is the United States doing in the face of all this? It is releasing oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve at record speed. It is flying B-52 bombers over Iranian territory for the first time, signaling air supremacy. It is watching oil executives from Chevron and Shell stand up at industry conferences and warn that the disruptions are spreading from South Asia to Southeast Asia to Northeast Asia to Europe. And it is watching China and Pakistan present a peace framework to the world that does not include a single mention of the nuclear question, which was ostensibly the entire reason this war began. The US is unlikely to embrace the proposal as it makes no mention of nuclear proliferation or uranium enrichment. The Trump administration ostensibly began the war to ensure that Iran remained unable to develop a nuclear weapon. That gap between what the China-Pakistan plan offers and what Washington says it went to war to achieve is the central tension that will define whether this peace initiative goes anywhere or simply becomes another piece of diplomatic theater. But here is where history is instructive. Wars that drag past their stated objectives, wars that create economic pain for the populations of the countries waging them, wars that destabilize the global order without achieving the clean resolution that was promised, those wars tend to end through backchannels, through intermediaries, through exactly the kind of indirect framework that China and Pakistan are now offering. The formal justifications may remain in place publicly, but the actual negotiation happens quietly through the very corridors that Pakistan is now opening and China is now backing. Trump is planning to visit China in May after his trip was postponed due to the war. That detail is not a footnote. That detail is a signal. If the United States truly believed China was an adversary undermining its war aims, the presidential visit to Beijing would be off the table entirely. It is not off the table, which means the conversation is already happening at a level that the public posturing does not reveal. What this moment really represents is something that serious students of history and geopolitics have been anticipating for years. The moment when the unipolar world order that emerged from the Cold War finally and publicly begins to give way to something more multipolar, more contested, and more genuinely complex. The United States is still the most powerful military force on Earth. That is not in question. But military power and diplomatic leadership are two different things, and right now the country that is being looked to for diplomatic leadership in this crisis is not Washington, it is Beijing, and the country carrying the messages is not a traditional American ally, it is Islamabad. That is not a statement of who is right or wrong in this war. It is a statement about how the world has reorganized itself beneath the surface of the headlines, quietly, systematically, over many years, and the Iran war has simply made that reorganization visible in a way that can no longer be ignored or explained away. The 5-point plan from China and Pakistan may succeed, it may fail, Tehran may embrace it or reject it. Washington may find a way to absorb it or may publicly push back against the framing, but none of those outcomes change the deeper reality that this plan's existence has already revealed. The world has changed. The center of diplomatic gravity is shifting, and the Americans who are paying more at the gas pump, watching their grocery bills rise and wondering what exactly this war is achieving, they deserve to understand not just the surface story but the architecture underneath it, because that architecture is what will determine the shape of the world their children inherit.